Imagine being married, yet living like strangers. Imagine sharing a name, a home, a future on paper, yet not a single night under the same roof. But everything changed the moment a door slammed, and a man who had always kept his distance finally said, "Enough." A marriage without intimacy is not merely the absence of shared physical space. It is the quiet erosion of connection, the slow unraveling of what a relationship is supposed to nurture. In this story, the husband and wife lived under the same grand roof, surrounded by luxury, stability, and everything money could buy, except closeness. For an entire year, their marriage existed in a suspended state, legal, acknowledged, and even admired by the world, yet hollow at its core. What made their situation more striking was not just that they slept in separate rooms, but that they existed like two parallel lines, always near, never touching. They shared meals out of obligation, conversations out of politeness, and a household out of circumstance. Yet there was an invisible barrier between them, something neither spoke of, but both felt deeply. Every evening, when she passed his closed door on her way to her own room, there was a weight in the air, a reminder of the emotional gap they were both choosing, consciously or unconsciously, to maintain. For her, the silence was not comfortable, it was a quiet ache. She had entered this marriage with modest expectations, not of fairy tale romance but of partnership, companionship, warmth, mutual respect. She was not demanding by nature, not someone who voiced dissatisfaction loudly. Instead, she felt her emotions inwardly, letting them settle in her chest like stones. Each night she slept alone, she wondered if she should have spoken up, if she should have asked why they lived like polite strangers rather than husband and wife. But pride and fear often intertwine, and she convinced herself that time would eventually soften the edges between them. He, on the other hand, was a man shaped by ambition and guarded by routine. His wealth had become both his armor and his cage. Success had taught him to focus relentlessly, to compartmentalize everything, including his emotions. Intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability required honesty, something he had avoided for years. The idea of sharing a bed, of getting close enough for someone to see beyond his external success into the hidden, softer parts of himself, felt threatening. So he kept his distance, convincing himself that physical separation would prevent emotional entanglement. But the truth was that their emotional distance was not neutral. It was a kind of quiet suffering for both. The household staff noticed the distance, the way they never entered or exited rooms together, the way conversations remained formal. Guests sensed something was off, though neither spouse allowed any hint of tension to escape. They maintained a facade of stability because the world expected it from a man of his stature and a woman of her grace. Their separate rooms became symbolic. His was immaculate, structured, a testament to control. Hers was softer, filled with personal touches. A shawl draped over a chair, a novel left face. Down on the bedside table, a plant by the window she tended each morning. These two spaces reflected the emotional landscapes they occupied. His, guarded; hers, hopeful but lonely. In the early months, she waited for him to reach out. She thought perhaps he was overwhelmed, or needed time, or simply moved slowly in relationships. She kept her door slightly open at night, not as an invitation, but as a silent signal that she was willing. But days became weeks, and weeks slid into months, and the gap remained. Eventually, she began closing her door too, not out of anger but self-protection. There is only so long someone can wait with an open heart before the quiet begins to hurt. He noticed the closed door. He noticed more than he let on. Her absence in his nightly routines, her silence at dinner, the gentle but growing emotional distance. These things registered in his mind even if he refused to act on them. Each night he told himself he preferred solitude, that intimacy complicated life, that he was not built for sentiment. But there were moments, fleeting, unspoken, when he paused at a door, hearing the faint sound of her turning pages late at night or the soft rustle of sheets, and felt something unfamiliar, longing. Their marriage became a pattern, a cycle neither knew how to break. She suppressed her hurt and acted composed. He buried his confusion beneath work and discipline. They attended events side by side but never shoulder to shoulder. In public, they appeared united. In private, they lived like two travelers staying in the same hotel but never crossing paths. The loneliness of a marriage without intimacy is a unique kind of isolation. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being with someone who feels unreachable. She felt unseen, not because he didn't look at her, but because his gaze never softened. He felt misunderstood, not because she judged him, but because he assumed she would if he revealed too much. Both feared taking the first step. Both were waiting for the other to bridge the gap, and so the year passed, quietly, politely, painfully. A marriage like this is a slow ache, a quiet reminder that proximity does not equal connection, and that a bed shared means far more than just physical closeness. It symbolizes vulnerability, trust, presence, things neither had been able to offer. And as the year reached its final stretch, the distance between them felt both familiar and unbearable, like a silence that had lasted one day too long. Quiet strength is often misunderstood. It is not loud, not dramatic, not something that draws attention. It is the kind of strength that grows silently, like roots beneath the ground, unseen, but powerful enough to hold up everything above it. And in this story, the wife embodied exactly that. She was not weak, not submissive, not naive. She was patient. She was composed. She was steady in a way most people never learn to be. From the outside, people might have looked at her and assumed she endured a distant marriage because she lacked courage or confidence. But those who saw only her silence misunderstood the depth of her resilience. Silence, in her case, was not surrender. It was a choice, a deliberate decision not to beg for attention, not to chase affection, not to demand what should be freely given. She believed in dignity, in giving space, in letting hearts open on their own time. This was her quiet strength. Every morning, she performed her routines with grace. She woke before the sun, not because anyone expected it, but because it gave her peace. She would brew tea, water the small plant by her window, and step onto the balcony to breathe in the cool air. These small acts grounded her. They reminded her that even in a marriage lacking warmth, she could still create pockets of calm, beauty, and purpose. She did not flood the house with complaints or accuse her husband of neglect. Instead, she moved through her days with self-respect. She greeted him politely even when he barely met her eyes. She set the table when they ate together, not because she felt obligated, but because she believed shared meals mattered, even if the connection was fragile. She asked about his work, about his projects, about his long hours. Sometimes he answered curtly, sometimes he didn't answer at all, but she never let disrespect settle into her heart. She refused to let bitterness define her. This was her quiet strength. Inside her room, she built a sanctuary. Soft linens, a favorite shawl draped over her chair, books with marked pages, a candle that carried a warm scent. Little things that gave her comfort when the rest of the house felt cold. She journaled at night, not to complain, but to release everything she kept inside, her hopes, her disappointments, her questions, her fears. She wrote about the man she married not with resentment, but with a strange mixture of confusion and compassion. She knew he wasn't cruel, he was guarded, and she understood that guarded hearts often need more time to trust. She did not push, she did not beg. She simply remained steady. Her friends, when they heard rumors of the couple sleeping separately, offered advice, some helpful, some not. Confront him, make him jealous, leave him, find someone who appreciates you. But she never reacted impulsively. She knew her marriage was complicated, layered, shaped by reasons no one else could understand. She also knew that her husband was a man carved by stress, shaped by loneliness long before she entered his life. She saw through the armor he wore, even if he never revealed the softer parts himself. And though she wouldn't admit it aloud, she hoped, quietly, patiently, that one day he might let her in. This was her quiet strength. Her restraint was not weakness, it was intentional. She wanted a partnership built on willingness, not pressure. She wanted a husband who came forward because he chose to, not because he was chased into a corner. She believed in allowing people the space to grow, even if that meant enduring loneliness in the process. She believed that real connection could not be forced, and beneath her calm demeanor was a heart capable of loyalty, courage, and remarkable patience. Yet patience does not mean she felt nothing. There were nights when she sat on her bed, holding a book she never really read, thinking about the distance between them. She would hear him return late, the sound of his footsteps halting near her door before continuing to his own room. Those brief pauses, the ones he thought she didn't notice, meant something. They told her he felt the distance too, even if he hid it behind silence. She did not interpret those moments as victory or reassurance. Instead, she saw them as signs that the man behind the closed door was not as indifferent as he pretended to be, and that tiny understanding fueled her quiet endurance. Her strength also showed in the way she carried herself publicly. At gatherings, she stood by his side with poise. She didn't expose their private struggles. She didn't compare herself to the wives who boasted about romantic dinners or extravagant vacations. Instead, she held her head high, offering warmth to others even when she received none at home. People admired her for her composure, unaware of the silent heaviness she carried inside. But perhaps her greatest strength was this: she never lost herself. She didn't shrink to fit the coldness of the marriage. She didn't dim her softness just because it wasn't mirrored. She kept nurturing the parts of herself that made her who she was: kindness, gentleness, empathy, and quiet determination. She refused to become hardened, even though she lived in a space that could easily have turned her bitter. Quiet strength is powerful because it endures. It waits with dignity, it hopes without breaking, it holds on without losing itself. And as the year went by, she remained steady, a silent force neither of them fully recognized the depth of yet. Wealth can shield a man from many things: uncertainty, discomfort, even failure, but it cannot shield him from himself. And for the millionaire in this story, the most fortified, most inaccessible territory was not his mansion, his empire, or his reputation. It was his own heart. To the outside world, he was the epitome of control. Everything about him exuded discipline: his posture, his schedule, his sharp, deliberate speech. People admired his confidence, envied his success, and praised the empire he had built from nothing more than strategy, risk, and relentless work. But beneath all that polish and power was a man who had learned long ago that emotional closeness came with a cost he was unwilling to pay. His emotional walls were not accidental. They were engineered, brick by brick, from years of disappointment, betrayal, and unresolved wounds. As a young man, he had learned quickly that vulnerability made him a target. Trust was something others demanded but rarely honored. He had invested in people, friends, business partners, even past relationships, only to find that loyalty was not as common as ambition, so he built barriers. At first small, then higher, then thicker, until eventually nothing could get in unless he allowed it, and he rarely allowed it. Marriage had been a logical decision for him, not a romantic one. A partnership on paper, a socially acceptable step for a man of his status. He chose a woman who was calm, grounded, and sincere, qualities he admired because they contrasted with the chaos of his world. But admiration was not the same as readiness, and readiness was something he never had. On their wedding night, he stood at the threshold of the shared room, watching her place her jewelry on the dresser. Something tightened in his chest, a strange sensation, unfamiliar and unsettling, a whisper of vulnerability. Instead of crossing the room, instead of sitting beside her, instead of acknowledging even a flicker of fear or desire, he retreated. He mumbled something about work, about meetings, about needing rest. Then he walked away and slept in the adjoining guest room. One night turned into two into weeks, weeks into months, and before either of them realized it, separate bedrooms had become the unspoken rule of their marriage. He justified it to himself. He needed space. He needed peace. He needed control. But the truth, buried deep beneath logic and routine, was that he feared what might happen if he let her close. He feared she would see the parts of him he kept hidden, the insecurities, the doubts, the scars. He feared needing someone. He feared caring too much. His emotional walls were tall and cold, yet ironically, they isolated him more than they protected him. Every morning he saw her at the breakfast table, a calm presence with gentle eyes, and something in him softened in ways he did not understand. But softness was dangerous, so he replied with one-word answers, avoiding her gaze, distracting himself with emails, meetings, and headlines. He didn't realize how much space she gave him, how she moved quietly through the house so as not to disturb him, how she respected his distance even when she didn't understand it. He saw her patience, but he misinterpreted it as acceptance. He told himself she did not mind, that she preferred it this way too, that their silent arrangement suited them both. But that was a lie he told himself because the truth required too much honesty. At night, he worked late, often long after she had gone to bed. The hum of his computer, the scratching of his pen, the glow of the lamp, these were his companions. Anything that kept his mind busy and his heart numbed was welcome. He convinced himself he was building a future for them, providing, achieving, doing what a husband should. Yet he ignored the most basic truth. A home cannot be built on silence, and still there were cracks in his walls, small ones, but there. Sometimes he paused outside her door on his way to his own room. He never knocked, never opened it, but he lingered for a few moments, listening to the quiet within. On rare nights, he thought he heard her sigh softly, and his hand would twitch, as if tempted to reach for the doorknob. But fear pulled him back every time. In those moments, the loneliness he denied pressed against him. He wondered what it would feel like to let her in, to speak honestly, to share a bed, not just for warmth, but for connection. But vulnerability required courage he didn't believe he possessed. What unsettled him most was how she never pushed him. She never questioned, never demanded, never confronted. Her grace disarmed him more than anger ever could. Because anger he could handle, anger he understood, but patience, true, quiet patience, was something his walls had no defense against. He began noticing her more, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when reading, how she smiled politely at the staff, how she kept her disappointments hidden behind a composed expression. He noticed the calm presence she brought into the cold spaces of the mansion. She didn't try to fill the silence with noise. She simply existed with a quiet dignity that softened the air around her. And for a man used to turbulence, her steadiness scared him more than chaos ever had. His emotional walls kept her out, but they also kept him trapped. Every day he felt the distance growing heavier, like a truth he could no longer outrun. He was a man who could solve any crisis, negotiate any deal, and control any situation, except the growing ache in his chest whenever he realized how far apart they truly were. He didn't know yet that the walls he built to protect himself were the same walls that would eventually make him reach his breaking point. Turning points rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with fanfare or grand gestures. Sometimes they appear in a single moment, sharp, unplanned, instinctive. For this couple, the turning point came in the form of a door, slammed not out of anger, but out of something far more powerful, awakening. It began like any other day, or at least that's how he expected it to unfold. Meetings, calls, negotiations. His hours filled with noise and responsibility. But beneath the polished exterior and the disciplined routine, something had been shifting inside him for weeks. A quiet tension, a restlessness, a pull he didn't understand. He had begun noticing too much. The empty dinner chair where she used to sit waiting. The way her laughter had grown rare, replaced by polite smiles. The subtle distance in her eyes, an emotional space mirroring the physical one he had created. She wasn't resentful, she was resigned, and somehow that struck deeper than anger ever could have. That morning, he left for work feeling unsettled. Her soft "take care" followed him to the door, but something in her tone, gentle, tired, detached, lodged itself in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He brushed it off, drowning his thoughts in work, but it lingered, repeating itself in his mind long after the words had faded. By late evening, after a long and unexpectedly frustrating meeting, something inside him finally snapped, not in rage, but in realization. He returned home earlier than usual, his heart beating faster than it should have. He didn't know what he was expecting, only that he needed to see her. The mansion was quiet when he walked in, too quiet. He stepped into the hallway, loosening his tie, his eyes scanning for her. He heard faint rustling from her room, the room he had never entered since their wedding day. The sound made him pause mid-step, his breath caught without warning. For the first time in a year, he wondered, what if she's tired of waiting? What if she's giving up? What if I pushed her too far away to ever come back? 1,000 unspoken fears collided inside him, fears he had avoided, repressed, ignored. But tonight, the weight of them became too much. He walked down the hallway with long, determined strides, almost as if something was pulling him forward. But the moment he reached her door, everything inside him erupted, not in fury, but in panic. Not panic of losing control, but of losing her. His hand pushed the door open faster than he meant to. It hit the wall with a sharp, resounding slam. The sound echoed through the house, startling even him. It was loud, final, a declaration he had never voiced aloud. She looked up from her bed. Why? Died, startled, her book slipping from her hands. In that instant, everything stopped. The air, the distance, the silence. His chest rose and fell sharply, his breath uneven. For the first time, she saw cracks in the composure he always wore like armor. He stood there in the doorway, his hand still on the knob, jaw clenched, eyes burning with something he had never allowed her to see, or emotion. A year's worth of suppressed feelings surged through him, guilt, longing, regret, confusion. But above all, a fierce realization that his silence had done more damage than he ever intended. She blinked, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. The shock on her face wasn't just from the slammed door. It was from seeing him look. Human, uncertain, vulnerable. That vulnerability terrified him, but losing her terrified him more. He took a few steps into the room, closing the distance neither of them had dared to approach before. His voice, when it finally emerged, was rough, unsteady, stripped of its usual calm. I can't do this anymore. He didn't specify what this meant, the separation, the silence, the distance. But she understood. His eyes told the story his words couldn't. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She was too stunned, too unprepared for the man she had known only as distant and controlled to suddenly stand before her, shaken and emotional. He wasn't thinking clearly. For once, he wasn't analyzing or strategizing. He wasn't the millionaire who calculated every move with precision. He was just a man who had spent too long hiding behind walls that were now collapsing under the weight of his own emotions. That moment, the slam of the door, the trembling in his voice, the intensity in his gaze, was a rupture in their year of stagnation, a shift that neither of them could ignore or undo, because a slammed door, in this case, was not a sign of anger. It was a sign of awakening, a sign of urgency, a sign that his fear of intimacy had finally grown smaller than his fear of losing her. The sound of that door marked the first real moment of their marriage, the first moment that broke the pattern of politeness and distance. It was the crack in the silence they both needed, even if neither had asked for it. It was the moment his walls betrayed him, the moment he could no longer pretend he felt nothing, the moment everything he had avoided finally forced itself to the surface. And as he stood before her, chest rising, heart exposed in a way he had never allowed before, he realized that this, right here, was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to imagine. Reclaiming a relationship does not begin with grand gestures, candlelit apologies, or rehearsed speeches. It begins with a moment of truth, a moment when one person finally steps forward, raw and unguarded, acknowledging the damage distance has caused. For him, reclaiming their relationship began the second that door slammed behind him. It wasn't the sound itself. It was the finality in his own actions, the undeniable realization that something had shifted inside him, something he could no longer suppress, For a year, he had lived within walls he built meticulously, believing silence kept him safe. But now, standing in her room, her sanctuary, the weight of his decisions confronted him. Her stunned expression, the widening of her eyes, the subtle tremble of her fingers as her book slipped onto the duvet. It all struck him with the force of a truth he had refused to see. He had pushed her away, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. And she had accepted it with a grace he did not deserve. Reclaiming their relationship began not with confidence, but with fear. Fear of losing the one thing he never admitted he valued. He stood before her, breathing unevenly, as if years of emotions had suddenly broken through a dam. Every day he had walked past her room, pretending he didn't care, pretending her distance didn't sting. But tonight the distance felt unbearable. Tonight he needed her presence more than he needed his pride. She sat in silence, waiting, unsure whether this was a moment of anger, desperation, or revelation. She didn't move, she didn't speak. She simply watched him, this man who had always kept his emotions buried, now standing in front of her, disoriented by his own vulnerability. He took another step inside, then another. Each step felt like crossing a threshold he had avoided for far too long. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the authority he was known for in boardrooms. It carried something far more human. "This," he said, gaze drifting around the room before settling back on her, "this distance. I can't do it anymore. A confession, a surrender, a beginning." She inhaled softly, not expecting those words, not expecting anything at all from the man who had built his reputation on emotional control. Her eyes softened, not with hope just yet, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. She wanted to understand what had brought him here, why tonight was different from the hundreds of nights he had walked away without a word. He ran a hand through his hair, something he did only when struggling. It unsettled him how difficult it was to speak honestly. He was a man who could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts without blinking, yet standing in front of his own wife stripped him of every practiced speech. He didn't know where to begin. He didn't know how to explain a year of silence. He didn't know how to unravel the fear that had kept him away. So he started with the one truth he could grasp. "I've been wrong," he said quietly. "I thought distance would protect us, or protect me. I don't know anymore, but I can't ignore what I feel, not tonight." The words sounded clumsy but sincere. His voice wavered, not from weakness, but from a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show. She watched him carefully, her heartbeat steady but her mind racing. For a year, she had wondered if he had any feelings at all, if he cared, if he noticed, if he regretted the silence. She had prepared herself for a life of polite coexistence. She had surrendered the hope of closeness long ago, not because she wanted to, but because waiting indefinitely felt like breaking slowly. Yet here he was, breaking first. He moved closer, stopping just an arm's length away. "I don't expect forgiveness," he murmured. "I just want to try if you'll let me." It was the first time he had ever asked her for anything, the first time he had placed himself, not as the man in control, but as someone wanting, uncertain, almost afraid. Reclaiming the relationship meant more than entering her room. It meant tearing down the emotional fortress he had built, brick by brick, without knowing whether she would meet him halfway. She lowered her eyes, absorbing his words. The ache she had carried for so long softened, not vanished, but eased. She didn't speak yet. She needed time. She needed honesty. She needed clarity. But she could feel something changing in the air between them, a shift so subtle, yet so powerful that her breath caught. He took one more hesitant step, waiting for any sign from her: rejection, acceptance, hesitation. Anything. His voice lowered to a whisper. "I want us, not whatever we've been. I want something real." She finally looked up then, meeting his eyes fully. And in the silence that followed, something profound passed between them. Not forgiveness, not resolution, but the fragile beginning of change. Reclaiming the relationship was not a single moment. It was this, a man letting down his guard, a woman seeing him clearly for the first time, two hearts standing on uncertain ground, willing to take the first step not as strangers, but as something almost new. There are moments in life that don't politely knock before entering. They arrive like a storm, uninvited, undeniable, and unforgettable. For Emily, that moment came on a night when the world felt unusually still, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold. It was the night when Jonathan, cold, distant, emotionally unreachable for an entire year, finally cracked the walls he had built around himself, not with gentle confession, but with a fierce, impulsive action that neither of them expected. The sound of a door slamming shut and a man who had run for too long finally refusing to run anymore. For a full year of marriage, Emily lived as though she was sharing a home with a ghost. Jonathan was present but unreachable, polite but icy, dutiful but absent in every way that mattered. Their arrangement was built on practicality, convenience, and a mutual benefit that had nothing to do with affection. She never asked for more, and he never volunteered it. They were two signatures on a contract, two last names on a legal document, two strangers playing the roles of husband and wife. But marriage has a quiet way of building pressure beneath the surface. Even when hearts are locked, proximity creates cracks, a shared meal, a rare laugh, a moment where eyes linger just a second too long, or evenings when a silence between two people grows so heavy it becomes a language of its own. The tension had been gathering like thunderclouds for months, invisible but heavy, waiting for the right moment to break. That moment came on an evening when Emily least expected it. Jonathan had returned home early, something he never did. His schedule was always filled with meetings, dinners, events, and excuses, but that night he walked in before sunset. Emily was in the guest room, her room, sorting through paperwork when she heard the sound of his footsteps down the hallway. They were different, heavier, decisive, carrying a strange energy that pricked her attention. Then the door opened. Jonathan stood there, his expression stern, intense, almost unreadable. He didn't ask permission, didn't give a reason, didn't disguise the storm he had brought home with him. "Pack your things," he said. The words struck her like a jolt. For a moment, Emily thought the worst, that he wanted her gone, that their marriage of convenience had reached its expiration date, that he was done pretending. "What? Why?" she managed to whisper. "We're done with this," he said, motioning around the room. "This distance, these separate lives, this arrangement." Before she could gather her breath, before she could understand, he stepped forward and the door slammed shut behind him. The sound was sharp, final, echoing through the room like a declaration of war. Or something far more dangerous. Emily froze. Jonathan had always been composed, calculating, polished like a man carved out of marble. But this version of him, intense, emotional, almost shaken, was someone she had never seen. His voice wasn't cold this time. It was rough, conflicted, like someone fighting a battle he had already lost long before entering the room. "You think I haven't noticed," he said softly, stepping closer. "How you've been here beside me, living in this house like a shadow. You think I didn't see the nights you cried quietly into your pillow, or the mornings you walked past me pretending everything was fine." Emily's breath hitched. She didn't think he noticed anything about her. She didn't think he cared, but he had been watching, feeling, responding. Silently, Jonathan continued, each step bringing him closer until the air between them felt electric. "I kept my distance for your sake. I didn't want to drag you into the mess of my past, my obligations, my life. But every day I woke up knowing you were in the next room and I wasn't allowed to be your husband. There it was." The truth he had buried under months of restraint and excuses. Emily felt her heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming realization that the man who had spent a year avoiding her was now standing in front of her, fighting himself not to reach for her. "You are my wife," he said quietly, "and I should have acted like your husband from day one." His admission shook her to the core. For a year, Emily believed she was tolerated, not wanted. Necessary, not valued. A convenience, not a partner. But now, with the door shut behind them and his voice trembling with honesty, the truth unraveled. He had cared all along too much, perhaps, and it terrified him. And in that locked room, with the weight of unspoken desire and suppressed emotions finally spilling into the space between them, Emily saw the man behind the millionaire mask, flawed, vulnerable, conflicted, real. It was the night the distance dissolved, the night the walls burned, the night he finally claimed her not out of entitlement, but out of a truth he could no longer deny. And Emily, stunned and breathless, realized that the marriage she once thought was nothing more than a contract was about to become something entirely different, something raw, irreversible, and powerful enough to change everything. And so, their story became more than just an unexpected marriage, more than a contract, more than a year of silence and distance. It became a reminder that sometimes relationships don't blossom through perfect beginnings. Sometimes they grow through storms, through misunderstandings, through the moments when two people finally stop running from themselves. Emily and Jonathan learned that love doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it breaks down doors. Sometimes it demands courage. Sometimes it forces you to face the truth you've tried hardest to hide. But when two souls finally meet without barriers, without fear, without the weight of their pasts holding them apart, something extraordinary happens. Their first year of marriage wasn't beautiful, but it was real. It was raw, it was human, and it taught them that connection isn't built in shared rooms, it's built in shared honesty. It isn't created by time, it's created by truth. It isn't defined by distance, it's defined by the moment two hearts choose to stop being strangers. And when Jonathan slammed that door, it wasn't an act of anger. It was the sound of a man shutting out everything that had kept him from choosing his wife. It was the moment he decided to stop living like a shadow in his own marriage. It was the moment he finally let himself feel. Their journey didn't end with that night, it began there, in a locked room, with two people finally learning how to speak, how to listen, how to trust, how to love. And as we reflect on their story, let us remember this. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not when we open doors, but when we close them behind us and decide that running is no longer an option. Sometimes love doesn't whisper, it demands to be heard, and when it does, it changes everything.